Hello, my wonderful third graders. I am so excited to start Unit 8 with you today. Native Americans, Regions, and Cultures. So we're going to hear about and learn about different Native American tribes. And in your reader, you're going to be reading Native American legends. And I'm just really excited about this. So lesson 1 is called Spreading Through the Continent. Where did the Native Americans come from? Vocabulary you will hear throughout the read aloud. Adapt is a verb. It means to change, to fit in better, to become used to. When Isabella goes to a new school next year, she will have to adapt to the new schedule and new rules. Embedded is also a verb, to be fixed into a surrounding object, rooted. The stone had been so firmly embedded in the ground that we could not move it. Nomadic is an adjective, means relating to people who move from place to place for various reasons, often in search of food. Prehistoric is also an adjective, and it means describes the time before history was written down by people. Prey is a noun. It's an animal that is hunted as food. Regions, also a noun, large spaces or geographic areas. Sustenance is a fancy word for something like food, a way to sustain life or nourishment. The Alvarez family's garden provided sustenance to them throughout the summer months. A woolly mammoth. Woolly mammoths, large mammals now extinct that roamed parts of North America and Asia and that were hunted by the prehistoric people who migrated from Asia to North America. We will learn more about them. On which continent do we live? Right? Remember, we've learned there are 7 continents. Where do we live? We live right over here in the United States. We live in the United States of America, but the continent is called North America, right? And that's this big thing right here. Look how big Canada is. Right here. And we can see Alaska, which is actually part of the United States, but is not connected to the United States. It's up here to the north and west of Canada, right here. For the next several days, you will be learning about the earliest known people who lived in North America. These early people are often referred to as natives, Native Americans, Indians, or American Indians. You'll be hearing how these people came to be known as Indians, but in this domain, these people will most often be referred to as Native Americans. Do you know what native means? The word native means an original resident of a particular place. It means you're from that place. So you might be a native of Lawrenceburg if you were born and have lived your whole life in Lawrenceburg. Why are these people called Native Americans? Because they are the earliest known residents of the continent of North America. You're going to hear several names that have been given to groups and tribes of Native Americans, but we cannot know for sure what some of these early people called themselves. You will hear more about this when learning about each region and its groups and tribes. You're going to learn how the Native Americans first arrived on the continent of North America thousands of years ago, how they lived when they first arrived, how they adjusted to different environments, and how over time they started to form tribes with other people who shared similar languages, customs, beliefs, and traditions. Long, long ago, certain parts of the world looked very different from the way they do now. Look at this picture here. Long ago, large areas of the Earth's water were frozen during the Ice Age. An ice age is a time when large areas of land and water are covered by thick ice. A little more than the ice storm we had a few weeks ago. Actually, a lot more. There have been a number of ice ages throughout history, but when we talk about the Ice Age, we are talking about a major event that occurred during a time that is believed to have begun millions of years ago and ended about 10,000 years ago. On a world map, let's look, and we talked here is Alaska. And then if you look here, we have Asia. right? The world is not flat. We know that, right? The world is not flat. So this is actually, if it was on a globe, it would be curved and connected. Okay? So really, this part of Asia, this tip right here, is really close to right here in Alaska, because pretend like you're folding the paper over to make it round. Look at this poster right here. Well, this map shows the area between Asia and North America as it looked thousands of years ago. So scientists think that Asia and Alaska were actually connected by land. Okay? Which is different now. Now there is water in between. Not a whole giant ocean, but there is water in between, okay? But there used to be, scientists believe, that they were connected, which has something to do with where the Native Americans came from. Alaska, which is on the continent of North America, is separated from the continent of Asia by a body of water. But thousands of years ago, the land connecting the two continents was above water. This is because much of the Earth's water was frozen. The surface level of the water was much lower than it is today. So this is called Beringia. Because the ice had melted and the sea levels had risen, this landmass between Asia and North America is now beneath a body of water known as the Bering Strait. So in this map, the Bering Strait would be right here in between Alaska and Asia. You heard the word strait when you studied the ancient Roman civilization domain earlier this year. Do you remember what a strait is? It's a narrow passage of water that connects two larger bodies of water. The Bering Strait is a passage of water between these two bodies of water. So here's the picture right here. So the Bering Strait would have been right here in between. So it looked like this. You can see it right now. The Bering Strait. So this was actually connected because of the ice age right here. You can see these are some of the Native American regions that we will talk about. I want you to imagine a time long, long ago, so long ago that we cannot say for certain when. In this ancient time, people began to move from one land to another. These prehistoric people were nomadic hunters who traveled in groups. These prehistoric people began to move from the land we call Asia into the land we call North America. They did not plan to move from one land to another. They were simply following the herds of animals that they hunted for their own survival. It is thought that various groups of people ventured on foot across a vast, cold area between Asia and North America called Beringia, following herds of prehistoric animals. You may have learned about the glaciers that covered regions of Greenland if you studied about the Vikings, which we did. Who can tell me what a glacier is? Josie, I know you know what a glacier is. We did this in reading groups. It's a large, slow-moving body of ice and snow that forms around mountains and valleys. Historians think that the very beginning of this migration of ancient Asian people began during the last major ice age. It was during this ice age that large areas of the Earth's waters were frozen. At this time, northern regions of North America were covered in thick sheets of ice and giant glistening glaciers. As you heard earlier, because water had turned to ice during the ice age, sea levels had dropped and certain areas of land had become uncovered. Beringia was one of these areas. As these prehistoric people moved across Beringia, they lived and hunted in this icy world. There they followed and hunted great herds of large mammals, such as woolly mammoths, mastodons, giant bison or buffalo, saber-toothed cats, and giant ground sloths. These large mammals are known as big game. All of these animals were prey for the people who migrated or moved from Asia to North America. Those are some pretty cool historic creatures. woolly mammoths, mastodons, giant bison or buffalo, saber-toothed tigers, and giant ground sloths. It makes me think of the movie Ice Age. This is almost certainly not the only way that people arrived in North America. It is also likely that people came to North America in boats following the coastline in search of land and food, and they stayed because they discovered an abundance of new resources. This migration of people and animals did not happen all at one time, nor did these people come from only one place. People moved from across Asia into North America over a period of time. Here's some of those animals. This is a statue of a giant sloth. Who is it that loves sloths? Is it Cadence? Can you imagine a giant sloth that's bigger than you? We'll have to do some research on those. And then here we see a saber-toothed tiger. However they arrived, they are believed to be the very first people to inhabit North America. Eventually, as the climate began to warm and the ice-covered land began to thaw, it became possible to travel even farther into North America. Giant glaciers that had blocked native people's paths melted. People moved south through an area that opened up between two enormous glaciers. So people started moving south because the ice was melting. Scientists call this path between these glaciers the ice-free corridor. This corridor or passage was cold and wet but habitable. What does habitable mean? Think of habit as part of habitat, so it means that people could live there and survive. And so large numbers of native peoples continued to migrate or move in small groups just as before. They lived a nomadic life as they followed the herds of animals that they preyed upon. In order to survive in this way, these native peoples had to be expert hunters. Although we do not know much about this period of human history, archaeologists have discovered a variety of spears, including leaf-shaped spears, embedded in mammoths' bones, in addition to tools for scraping and carving bone. It also seems that prehistoric hunters used a spear thrower. This device was a short rod with a hook on the end. It enabled the hunter to throw a spear or dart with a great deal more accuracy and power. It's also believed that these early Native Americans learned how to domesticate dogs so they could be used to help them hunt and travel. They had dogs as pets that also had a job. We can only imagine what life must have been like for these early peoples as they endeavored to survive in an ice-cold world by hunting creatures such as the 9-foot-tall woolly mammoth. It's really tall. With nothing more than a spear and stealth, they would have hunted in groups to take down their prey. A woolly mammoth would have provided many pounds of meat, as well as fur, tusks, and bones. A band of hunters and their families would most likely have stayed with the carcass or dead animal of the animal until the food supply ran out. In addition to food, the animals they hunted provided these native people with clothes. Archaeologists have discovered artifacts and other evidence that tells us that animal hides were stretched out to dry and afterward were sewn together using simple tools made of rock or bone to provide either clothing or a form of shelter. There's the mammoth. As the Earth's climate changed and it became warmer, the way these early people lived changed too. Gradually, many prehistoric animals that had been hunted for their meat, fur, and bones disappeared from our world forever. Were they hunted to extinction by people struggling to survive in a changing world? Or did climate change alter the delicate balance of the food chain to such an extent that these mammoths could no longer find the foods they needed to live? We'll never know for certain the answers to these questions. We do know that the saber-toothed tiger and the woolly mammoth no longer wander this land, whereas other ancient creatures such as buffalo did survive. What do you think this picture is of? What kind of bone do you think that is? Looks like a woolly mammoth skull to me. It does appear that some animals were more able to adapt to climate change than others. The buffalo, for example, is thought to have become smaller and swifter over time. Once the ice was gone, new plants, grasses, and trees emerged, and various animals adapted to a new diet. Native peoples adapted too. They found other smaller prey to hunt, such as deer and rabbits, as well as new varieties of fruits, nuts, and seeds to gather and consume or eat. These prehistoric people looked even more to the oceans, lakes, and rivers for sustenance and a means of transportation. Both people and animals adapt to their environments. Throughout this domain, you'll be hearing how different groups of Native Americans adapted to the environments of the regions in which they settled. So, do you think different people would have to adapt differently depending on where they are? Do you think Native Americans that settled in an area like Kentucky would adapt differently than Native Americans that settled in an area like Canada? Probably. And so eventually, over many years, people moved right across this vast expanse of land to various regions, to the wide open grasslands of the Central Plains, to the northeastern and southeastern woodlands, swamplands, and coastal regions, and to the sun-drenched west coast and dry southwestern deserts. Some people settled in the far north regions of the Arctic and subarctic. Some people moved even farther south into what we now call the continent of South America. Look at these photographs. See how these different habitats where people settled are very different. Eventually, many ancient people chose to no longer live nomadic lives. Remember, nomadic means they're following their food source around and they don't stay in one place. But instead of choosing to settle in one place and establish permanent, but instead chose to settle in one place and establish permanent or semi-permanent settlements. The prefix semi means like kind of, sort of permanent. They may have decided this because they discovered regions where the food supplies were plentiful in the form of animals to hunt and fish, and plants to consume. In addition, there were natural resources such as fresh water to drink and wood or other materials that could be used to construct homes and build cooking fires. The temperature in some regions may also have been temptingly mild. One thing that is certain is that many native people began to farm, though they had previously survived by foraging for wild plants in addition to hunting prey. Now they're farmers. Native people began experimenting with planting and harvesting, and they eventually began to grow a variety of crops. Because of this, some people chose to stay in one place and, by their collective efforts, increase their own food supply. Over time, approximately 500 North American native tribes came to inhabit a wide variety of regions across North America. These native peoples, whose total population peaked or reached its highest number at about 20 million, would live their lives according to their own customs and cultures for thousands of years until European culture brought extreme changes to their ways of life. Look at this map. This is an image showing only some of the many Native American groups across North America. That's amazing. Look at all those groups. If you see the big names, those are the collective groups or bigger name for a bunch of little groups that we will be studying. The Mississippian, the Cherokee, the Adena, the Iroquois, the Hopi, the Pueblo, the Inuit, and Thule. We've been talking about prehistoric people. What does prehistoric mean? Refers to someone or something that existed during a time before people started writing down history. Did the people of Asia plan to migrate to the continent of North America? No. Why did they migrate across Beringa? They were following the herds of animals that were their prey. What were some of the big game animals that the early Americans hunted as their prey? Woolly mammoths, mastodons, giant bison or buffalo, saber-toothed tigers, and giant ground sloths. These, these prehistoric people were nomadic. What does it mean to be nomadic? To move from place to place, often in search of food. Why did many of the early Americans decide to stop being nomadic and choose to settle in permanent or semi permanent communities? They discovered regions where the food and natural resources were plentiful, so they were able to remain in one place to hunt animals and gather fruits, nuts, and other plants to eat. Eventually, they began to farm in those areas in which they settled. If these events were all prehistoric and so were not written down, from whose point of view do we know what happened? Who tells us what happened? Archaeologists' point of view, right? Based on their discoveries and artifacts and stories passed down through many generations of people. Would you prefer to live a nomadic existence or settle in a permanent community? Why? Our word for today is, surprise, surprise, nomadic. In the read aloud you heard, these prehistoric people were nomadic hunters who traveled in groups. Say the word nomadic with me. Nomadic people are those who move from place to place, often in search of food. Today, there are nomadic people who move from place to place for various reasons. The nomadic people of the desert often rely on camels for transportation. Have you ever learned about nomadic people? There's nomadic people in lots of different countries. People that travel around. Gypsies are nomadic. Okay, good job, third graders. I hope you enjoyed this little introduction to Native Americans, and I'm excited to learn about the different tribes and regions that they lived in.